If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the scariest experience you have ever had? My time to shine. I've posted this before, but I feel reposting it won't hurt since it is to date the scariest thing to happen to me. When I was younger, I used to live by the woods and could see a cemetery from my back porch. One Easter I remember waking up and seeing the Easter bunny, one of those terrifying costumes, and what really gets me is I remember smelling the wet hay. When I woke up I didn't tell anyone, but there was an extra Easter egg in my house that my parents didn't hide. Years later when I was in high school I asked my parents if they ever dressed up like the Easter bunny and came into our room. They said they would never go through so much trouble. Then my younger sister, who I shared a bunk bed with when this happened, said she remembers when the Easter bunny came into our room and made a remark about the hay smell. I was terrified that we both remembered seeing a person dressed as a bunny in our room. To make it even stranger, I told the friends I sat with at lunch what happened. One of the girls was my neighbor across the street. She told me one Easter a long time she looked out her window during the night and saw the Easter bunny standing in her driveway. I had chills. To this day I am terrified of people in rabbit costumes. I was a campus security guard. My job was basically to make sure no one was in the buildings past midnight. It was 1 a.m. and I was going to clear the old psychiatric building. This is one of the only buildings on campus without lights constantly on, and on the job we aren't supposed to turn on lights cause someone who sees the lights on from outside might call the police and waste everybody's time. So I just had a flashlight. I was patrolling the top floor and it was fucking spooky. This was the building the campus bought from the city in the early 1900s that was a psych ward that the campus turned into a psychiatric building and eventually a biochemistry building. I heard a door creaking down the hall behind me and when I went to shut the door a fucking 6-tall man was in there in the dark so I yelled and bolted. As I ran out of the building I ate shit on the last flight of stairs and tumbled down. Unfortunately I landed right as my boss, an on-duty police officer, was coming in. She came in because of the scream. I told her there was someone upstairs. Then she walked down with a wooden statue carving of Sacagawea. What it was doing there I don't know, but that shit sucked ass. I grew up in a small town, and lived out in the country. My mom and I were coming home from Walmart really late one night and decided to take the back way home. I still had my learner's permit, so I wanted to take a road with less traffic. Anyone who has ever lived or been to the country knows how creepy these roads can be at night. I was going around a curve, right before a one-lane bridge, so I slowed down in case I had to stop. Out of nowhere this woman jumps in front of me to the driver's side of my car and starts pounding on the hood of my car. Her mouth was moving but I couldn't make out what she was saying. My mom started freaking out and told me not to stop, and just keep driving. I kept going and we both looked back to see where she was and no one was there. To this day my mom and I still remember it clearly. Turns out there's apparently a legend about a woman who died around the bridge and supposedly can be seen sometimes late at night. I get goosebumps to this day just thinking about it. When my niece was really young, she was in a bouncer at my sister's house. I was house and babysitting. I had left her to go to the kitchen to grab some water. My sister's chocolate labs were probably sniffing and licking her head because I could hear her giggling like she was having a blast. I hadn't noticed how cold it had gotten. Then I heard it. A loud wooden snap. Like a thick piece of wood had been snapped in half suddenly or a tree was knocked over. I ran into the room and what I saw and smelled freaked me out. The dogs were huddled in the corner whimpering. My niece was just staring at the ceiling corner with wide eyes, and it was cold and smelled like Stetson. I took her and we decided to go to a different room. When my sister finally came home, I told her what happened. She just rolled her eyes and said that is Hugh. I was confused. She said Hugh was the previous owner of the house who had died 10 years before his wife sold it. She said he likes to follow my niece around and you can tell it is him because the dogs freak, it gets cold and smells like cheap cologne. I don't believe in that shit, but I do believe that feeling you get in your gut when something doesn't feel right. I babysit my niece at my house now, sorry Hugh. As a young adult, I visited my mom in Tucson. She had me stay in the spare bedroom that basically had a bed, a sewing machine, a nightstand, and a walk-in closet. Middle of the night I wake up with a wave of fear. I know there is something watching me from the closet. I can't look directly that way, but in my peripheral vision I know the closet door is open and just dark inside. Whatever was there was evil and did not like me there, or so I thought. It probably wasn't too many minutes that I decided to just go back to sleep since nothing was happening, but I remember thinking that it was silly to be so scared, reminded me of when I was a kid. Next morning, wake up and mom's in the kitchen with her head buried in the crossword puzzle, coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other. I start to tell her the story of the weird thing that happened last night, and as the story continued she started to look up from her crossword, looked at me more intently, and her jaw started to drop. She explained that a few weeks back when my brother came to visit her and stayed in the same room, he described the very same story that happened to him, including that he was embarrassed to have that kind of fear as an adult. Just to add a little spice, the townhouse wasn't that old or anything, but it was built on the grounds of the former Tucson tuberculosis sanatorium. In high school my senior year, my parents traveled out of the country and my brother went to stay with a friend. I live on the outskirts of a large town in a fairly wooded area. I don't have any pets, but I heard barking outside. Naturally, being the dumbass I was, I went outside flashlight in hand. I see this yellow dog running around my yard chasing something. It stops running, looks straight at me and runs. I thought I had scared it, so I went back inside the house and got in my bed and was about to fall asleep. I then heard the most chilling sound. I can't describe it, it was just horrid and terrifying. The noise came from outside, so I went downstairs to check it out again. Stupidest decision ever. I got downstairs and I see this person outside, but the person did not look normal. I didn't know what to do, I just looked at him walk around my yard for a few minutes. Then he looked straight at me. This shocked me because 1, the blinds are closed and I'm peeking out of a crack, and 2, all the lights are off in the house, so I know I'm not making a shadow or anything. The only reason I even saw him is because the moon was full. We continued making eye contact for a few minutes, I rubbed my eyes, and he was gone. In college, I would go home every other weekend to work at the job I had since high school. I would drive directly from campus after my last class on Friday to my job, about an hour, and, after my shift was done, I'd go back to my parents' house which was out in the middle of nowhere. My parents weren't yet home when I got back from work. They often spend their Friday and Saturday evenings drinking like they were the ones in college, so the house was dark and, since it was mid-fall, so was the yard, save for the yard light. I pulled into my normal parking spot, got out of the car and then turned to open the back door of my car and get my backpack out of the back seat. That's when I noticed that the bathroom light was on. Was that light on when I pulled up? It must have been, right? As I was contemplating the light and reaching for my backpack, there was suddenly a very angry-looking old woman standing in the window staring at me. We're not talking resting bitch face here either, she was pissed off at me and I knew it. We stood there staring at each other for a good 10 seconds when my parents pulled into the driveway and distracted me from my stare down with the woman in the bathroom. By the time I turned back, the light was still on, but the woman was gone. While in university, I loved finding snakes. I was a biology student. So a friend from herpetology club showed me this road that he would cruise for snakes. Cruising is when you drive slowly down old back roads after dark looking for snakes that have slithered onto the warmer road to heat up. The road we took was about 4 miles and had around 4 houses on its entirety. We had taken a few laps on this road, and we were making our final pass. There are 2 houses near the beginning of the road, one at the end and one near the middle. We were getting close to the center house when we see movement on the left side of the road. There are a lot of animals, obviously, on this road, so we aren't surprised to see this. However, what shoots out is this kid, probably around 8 or 9 in torn blue jeans and a ripped dark t-shirt. He takes one look at us, and his face is a mix of fear and pain. He looked back really quickly from where he had come out of, then booked it across the road. The guy I'm with gets out of the car chasing to see if he's alright, and I pull the car up to the point where the boy went into the woods. I'm starting to get out of the car when my friend walks quickly back from the trail and just says, "Let's go, now." We hop in the car and tear out of there. He says there is a graveyard about 10 yards into the woods where there are 5 gravestones with the same death date. They all had the same last name, and one was a boy who was 9. We never came back the rest of the summer to that road. We usually would go out once or twice a week. The next year when my friend had graduated, I took my girlfriend out to the road. We had gone early to try to find different types of snakes. Different snakes tend to move at different points of dusk/night. We got to the house near the graveyard and there's 3 men doing some yard work. I rolled down the window, explained what I was doing and asked them about the graveyard. Apparently their dad's brother's family had all died when their space heater caught fire around 20 years ago. I kept pushing and asking about it, and they told me the fireman or whoever does it had found all the bodies in the rubble except for the youngest son, but they assumed he was too far burned. I asked if they had a little brother, and the 6 feet 4 inches 250-pound man said he was the youngest. When I gave the description of the kid I saw, and they all went white. They all have individually seen the kid I was talking about. And he always runs to the gravesite. I have never been down that road again. I grew up in a house on the west side of Chicago. This house had been built at about 1890. I figure at least one person has died there. When my brother was about 5, we were living on the second floor, renting out the ground floor to my aunt. The third floor was mostly burnt out and uninhabitable. One room had been fixed for my sister to live in. Well, we were watching a movie in the living room. And my brother asked me to walk him to the bathroom. The bathroom was maybe 15 feet from the sofa, but you had to pass the stairwell to the third floor to get to it. He asked me to please take him to the bathroom, and I told him no because of its proximity. He begged me and I still refused. I asked him what his problem was and he said, "There are people screaming upstairs, and they are on fire." I walked him to the bathroom. Years later, after moving out of state, my dad confessed that someone had burned to death in that fire, but he didn't tell us because he didn't want to scare us. A few weeks I was walking my dog late at night and I could see a woman a block or so away coming towards me on the same sidewalk. Nobody else was around, the street was deserted, just her and me. As she got a little closer I could see that she was walking slowly, was wearing shabby clothes, shuffling and dragging a foot. Her head was low to her chest and her hair was hanging, covering her face. When she was about 20 feet away I started to get nervous. She definitely looked odd and was moving purposefully and quicker than I thought. I was frightened now, but told myself I was being silly and overreacting. Stay calm, I thought. I tried to casually pull my dog to head off to the right, out of this woman's path, but no luck, my dog wasn't having it. When she was about a foot away she lifted her head a little and croaked hello, dear, and passed me on her way. She must have had some sort of disability or something, but I swear to God she looked just like a fucking zombie and scared the living shit out of me. When I was a kid the cabinets in my parents' house would slam every night after my father fell asleep. Then about 7 years ago, after gutting the house and adding an addition, I would see a figure in my bedroom doorway at very odd times. Then sometimes over my shoulder during the day I would see a man in a black suit with white hair. At this point I'm seeing this figure so often I start to question my sanity. The final night he bursts out of my closet and I finally see this terrifying old man's face. I close my eyes, scream, and I wait. When I opened my eyes he was gone. The image has been burned into my mind since. I don't see him again after that night. Now a few years later I'm home from college for my fall break and go to see a movie with my family. My brothers and I drive home separately from our parents, and being near Halloween are telling scary stories. I tell my experiences with the old man. My youngest brother, who was 16 at the time, starts to freak the fuck out. He had seen the man running at him from his closet the past 2 nights in a row. We have never spoke of it again. Pretty freaky thing happened to me and 4 of my friends when we were in middle school. 2 of my friends lived 3 houses down from each other, and across the street from their houses was a church and maybe half an acre of woods. This is in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, so there are just a bunch of houses surrounding the woods, church. So my friend, let's call him T, his brother, other friend, let's call him D, and third friend, A, who lived not too far, were all playing some manhunt, what 14-year-olds call hide and seek when played at night, and decide to split up into 2 teams and go into the woods. D and I were together, and T went with his brother, and they go into the woods and D and I walk up to the church. The church was left open most of the time, so we decided to sneak into it and hide out in the front room. Never got creepy vibes or anything from it, so we didn't think twice about going inside. We get up to the door and it's locked. Weird. So we turn around and start walking back towards the parking lot. For some reason I had turned around and looked back at the church as we were walking away. We both hear this impossibly loud sort of growling coming from what sounded like everywhere, which made it even scarier because we didn't know which way to run. To call it growling almost doesn't seem right because of how odd this sound was. It was so incredibly deep and low-pitched, and yet at the same time just so loud. So we panic and run towards T's house across the street. As we're running we see T, his brother, and A bolt out of the woods maybe 30 yards away from us, also running towards T's house. I remember yelling something along the lines of, "Did you guys hear it too?" To which T replied with something like, "Yeah dude, just run." We get to T's house, and once we get inside we all make rounds around the house locking all the windows and doors. We start talking about the noise and T says right before it happened they saw some long, strange shadow of a thing lurking around the woods not too far from where they had all been hiding. I live in Florida, and A suggested it may have been a panther. I've seen a panther only twice in my life, and once was in a zoo. I've heard the noises they make and there's no way what we heard was a panther, nor was it a bear, alligator, or any other animal I've ever seen here in the wild. Never heard, saw it again. Actually ended up banging 2 of my girlfriends in that parking lot in high school without anything spooky happening. I've had a lot of weird shit happen to me in my life, but this is probably the creepiest. A few years ago, I was living in a small Georgia town on the South Carolina border. We were renting out a house and it had quite a bit of property, the nearest neighbor probably being 1/4 mile away or so. I was in the kitchen one day making lunch and heard some kids playing outside, followed by an older woman yelling for them. Then screamed for them. A terrifying, life on the line, blood-curdling scream. I ran out the back door only to see a bunch of cows grazing. I totally forgot I was in the middle of nowhere and there was no way kids were playing that close to the kitchen window. I walked around the property just to make sure and never saw anything suspicious. So, later that night I tell my boyfriend when he gets home from work and he just kinda blows me off. Every few days I am hearing stuff now, sensing things, good and evil, and it's creepy as hell. The job my boyfriend is on is finally over and we travel for work. Once we're gone he tells me that after I told him he thought he was sensing things too and waking up every day at 3 a.m., wide awake. The best part? About a month after we leave we find out an entire family had been murdered in the house and we were the first people to rent it after it happened. I have another one. My wife and I have our room in the upper half story of our house, and we fashioned a room on one end of the space for our then 2 to 3-year-old daughter. Our room separated her space by a wall/door, and sort of between us was a crawl space for storage. Anyway, the first thing that happened we wrote off because it seemed so random. We're laying in bed one night and begin hearing this repeating sound, muffled. After the 4th or 5th time, I realized I was hearing the wonderful thing about Tigers are wonderful things. Bouncy, trouncy, over and over again. Went into the crawl space and found buried in a bin of toys this spring-loaded Tigger doll that would hop up and down on the floor while singing his song. Cool toy, but that night was kind of freaky. I later looked up that sometimes toys will go off if the battery is really old. Mystery solved. Within a week or two, our daughter was in her bed, and she never got out of bed once in. If she had to go to the bathroom or needed anything, she would just yell. That night, the wife and I were 2 floors down, in our basement entertainment area, watching a movie. We had our baby monitor on. At one point, there was a little static/hissing, I shit you not. I know there are horror movies with this scene, and I hear a voice but can only make out that it's a female. We lived next door to neighbors with cordless phones and sometimes would capture parts of their conversations on our baby monitor, so no big deal. Except that right after it happened, I could hear running footsteps upstairs. I ran up and saw my daughter at the other end of the floor in the bathroom. We kept the light on for her, standing in the corner of the bathroom wide-eyed, arms self-hugging, and she was cowering. That freaked us out. She couldn't even tell us that she was scared, let alone why. We started to conjure that there was a relationship to these events, which probably made us more sensitive to the next events. A few weeks or a month later, I'm laying in her little bed with her, reading a story. She asks me if she can read the book to her friend. I asked her who her friend was and she smiled as she talked about Mr. Ochsner. That's about as close as I could understand to the name she said. But she was sad because he was missing part of his leg from an accident, me freaking out big time. At this point she's only 2 or 3 ducking years old. She thought the accident had something to do with a brick, or so he told her. I asked her where Mr. Ochsner was. She, I shit you not, said. He's not from this world. Nope, but I couldn't nope out of there. We told my sister-in-law about it casually one day. She's all weird and ghost hunter why, and she gave us this huge candle holder about the size of a mango, made of amethyst, and told us to put it near her bed. Now I have a doctorate degree, and I'm starting to buy into this shit, not the amethyst part, but the shit my daughter would have to have a wild imagination to tell me. Long and short, we put the amethyst by her bed and never had another issue. She never spoke of Mr. Ochsner again. Happy Halloween. Anyway, it began when my best friend and I were about 12 years old. We also had another good friend who was about 8/9 at the time. We lived in Kentucky, so there are all kinds hills and wooded areas all around you, whether you live in a trailer up a hollow somewhere or you were in the suburbs. My friends and I spent almost every day with one another. We would ole with our DBZ toys, play our Pokemon games, or play with our Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards all day, and then once it got dark outside we'd sit out on the back porch and just talk about space, religion, and the supernatural. One night we started hearing this noise out in the woods. It was a muffled clapping noise. The best way to describe it is as if somewhere were wearing thin silk gloves and clapping. It would come in 5 seconds increments. We thought it might be deer butting heads or something. But then we dismissed it because it would always be perfectly timed and only when we weren't talking about. This eventually went on for over a year. Every night we would hear the clapping when we were outside at night, and the frequency would always increase when we discussed it. One night we were sitting in the backyard and I broke the horrible news to my friends that my family was moving out of the neighborhood. Right after I told them, the clapping started up. After we got done sniffling about and being sad that I was moving literally only 15 miles away, and stood up and said, but first let's figure out what that clapping is. So we grabbed our little video recorder we used for stop motion videos and started to climb up the hill. We still have the video and we went back a couple months ago and watched it. Sadly nothing spooky jumped out at us. But right as soon as we started climbing, our younger friend ate shit and slid down a 10-foot drop, so we helped him up and decided to turn back. Now this is where it gets bizarre. After I moved, our younger friend did as well, leaving the other guy, who was roughly 13 at this point. Of course he had a little sister and eventually his girlfriend that he would go outside with at night, but the clapping was gone. We've stayed best friends since then and I still went over to his house on a regular basis, but since I moved the clapping had 100% stopped. We're 21 now and 2 months ago we found ourselves home from uni and sitting on his back porch just chatting it up till about 1 a.m. when he brings up the clapping. Now at this point everything I've told you is the truth. I don't know if this is true or not, but he said he did some research and according to some article he found the clapping noise is some sort of demon that lures children into the woods. Of course I gave it a giggle and shrugged it off because he's the type of person that's always desperate for excitement and exaggerates a little. Not a minute later he goes, "Oh my god, did you hear that?" "No, what was it?" "I heard the clapping." "Yeah right, sure man." But then I listened carefully and surely enough it was back. Just the same as before, and it went on for 20 minutes before other weird noises started coming from the hill. There were what seemed like 2 trees fall in the woods out of nowhere too. This is when I decided 2:30 a.m. was a good time to go home. If anyone has any idea what this could have been, please share. When I was about 10 or 12, I don't really remember, I had an odd experience. At the time, I was sharing a room with my sister. We had lofted beds and I slept on the top bunk. We had this stereo and when you would press the button to turn it on, it would click and a red light would pop up. Our beds were on one side of the room and the stereo was on a desk on the opposite side. One night I was woken up by the click sound that the stereo makes when the power button is pressed. I recognized the sound and sat up in bed. I looked over at the stereo and the light blinks on. I look over at my sister and she is fast asleep. Her bed was under mine but perpendicular, so I could see the top half of her from my bed. The stereo is playing that white noise sound that it makes when it isn't on a specific station. Suddenly, I can hear someone saying, "Away," coming from the stereo. Just one word, "away." First, it starts off soft and gradually gets louder, until it becomes a yell, "Away, away." It took about 10 to 15 seconds probably to build up to the yell, and then it died back down to a whisper. I thought this was a dream. I was frozen out of fear. I thought this had to be my imagination, and I tried telling myself that during the whole thing. I had almost convinced myself of it until it stopped. After the voice died away, the stereo went back to static. Then, I heard the familiar click and the light turned off. I was positive I wasn't dreaming the ending click. I stared at the stereo for a few more moments, too freaked to move, looked back at my sister and saw she was still asleep, and finally laid back in bed, covered myself with my sheets, and willed myself back to sleep. I consider myself a rational person, but I had no rational explanation for this. Freakiest shit that has ever happened to me. Ducking shadow people. You know what those are? Goddamn people, but like, just the shadow in its own plane of existence. I saw 2, or maybe it was just 1 in 2 spots, when I was about 10. Shit still scares me to this day. So, me and a buddy, both fresh-faced, little kids, are out walking in the woods behind his house. We enter an area that's a little swampy, with reeds growing up about 6 feet tall, minimum. We're walking along a log, when out of the corner of my eye, I see what looks like a head and shoulders, but totally black, rise above the reeds, just for a second. I ignore it, figure it was just my active little kid imagination. We leave the swampy part and step out onto a wide trail, with brush lining either side. We take a few steps when holy double grandmother fucking Christ, a person, once again totally black, runs all hunched over from one side of the path to the other. The thing was dead silent, the brush was undisturbed on either side. We both saw it. My buddy turns to me. "Did you see that?" I nod, and we turn around and bolt back to his house as fast as our stubby legs could handle. Turns out he saw the first one too, and just didn't want to say anything because he also thought he imagined it. And shadow people still scare me to this day, even though I've never seen another one. Finally, I have a story. So my family moved to a house in a small town in Kansas in 2002, I was 10 and my brother is 2 years older. I didn't like it from the start, it weirded me out, I told my mom I thought it was haunted. Our bedrooms were upstairs and the piano that I hated was downstairs to the left of the stairs in the dining room past the kitchen. My brother liked to screw with me by playing the piano then hiding. He usually did it at night to screw with me before bed, which gave me really bad nightmares and made it difficult for me to sleep without a light on. So my mom years after admits to me she had several experiences with doors slamming and cabinets being open when we weren't home. So my brother and I were playing Mario Kart 64, actually getting along for once when I hear the piano again. So I told my brother real funny, "You got one of your friends to come over and play the piano to screw with me." He looks at me really scared, and says I thought you were doing the same thing. So we stop our game and my brother grabs a bat and tells me to follow him. I grab my BB gun and we slowly go down the stairs. When we get to the bottom stair the music stops. It's dead silent in the house, no windows open, no AC going. You can hear the faint sounds of Mario Kart in the background. So my brother just freezes in place. So young me says, "I don't know who you are, but I've got a loaded gun. So you better leave." When we get down to the bottom of the stairs we turn left to the kitchen. All the cabinets, fridge and freezer door are wide open. The piano key cover is open and the doors were all still locked. So we freak out and my brother calls our mom and tells her what's going on. She calms us down and says she's coming home. So we start to close the cabinets, and I go to the stairs and look up at the door. That door slams so hard it knocks a picture of me off the wall and breaks the glass. I freak out, shoot my BB gun, yes I still had it, at the door and run away screaming. My brother freaks out and runs out the other door and we are both sitting in the front yard when my mom gets home. We explain everything and we go to my dad's house that night and we end up staying the week. My mom moved us out that week. She said she had several experiences similar to that and doesn't feel safe there. Several years later the landlord was found in the basement dead. He shot himself in the stomach with a shotgun. I'm not going to say I believe in ghosts or it was haunted, but I don't know what it was that day and I don't want to know to be honest. I couldn't sleep with the lights off until I was 16. I don't believe in many things that can't be explained by logic or history, but for some odd reason a bump in the night or a series of coincidental events can really freak me out. I was madly in love. This was the summer of '07. I spent every day at my girlfriend's house. Her bedroom was massive, like TV sitcom big. She had a couch and a big TV. It was the perfect place to waste a summer foolishly wrapped up together. Directly above her room was a converted attic that served as her older brother's room. He hadn't lived there for a few years as he has graduated college etc., but that summer I knew he was back and forth, crashing at the house. We were watching a movie in her room and I heard a lot of noise coming from upstairs, like someone was moving things around. Tidying the place. Normal sounds of someone getting settled in. The movie ended and we were going to head downstairs for some food and I told her I wanted to stop upstairs to say hi to Mark, that's what we will call him for the sake of internet anonymity. She looked at me puzzled and explained that Mark wasn't home. I started explaining the noises, almost certain she was messing with me but shrugged it off and headed downstairs. After a couple more hours of hanging out I grabbed my stuff to head home for the night. I was barely 18 and I was driving my parents' car so I had to have it home in the morning. It was around 2 a.m. and as I kissed her goodnight in the foyer of her house, music abruptly broke the silence. It was loud. Like the type of loud when you have a cheap speaker on high volume. It was upbeat music, maybe 40s 50s era. My girlfriend's face went white as she panicked. It was coming from upstairs. All the way upstairs. We navigated the stairs and hallways together, clutching each other close. We tracked the sound into her brother's bathroom and sure enough in the pitch black a radio was playing. I turned on the bathroom light and shut off the radio. Confused, she stared at it. This radio normally stayed on the second floor. The occurrence was odd, but I was able to calm her enough to head up to bed. I got in the car and began my 20 to 30 minutes drive home. As I navigated the neighborhood I felt that the street lights were going off as I traveled beneath them. I paid closer attention and sure enough, they were. I wanted to block it out of my mind so I drive faster. Up ahead was a construction zone and the road narrowed significantly, but I maintained my speed. Before I could react I noticed a small figure dart into the road, perhaps a young boy or girl. I slammed the brakes, the car skidded to a stop and just like that, the car sputtered and died. I was frozen in the driver's seat. I didn't see anyone around. No small figure. But my eyes were playing tricks on me adjusting to the dark ahead. I frantically tried to start my car. Nothing. I picked up my cell phone and called my girlfriend. No answer. Then my parents. No answer. One more attempt and the car started again. The rest of the ride was mostly uneventful. I tuned into some sports radio to distract as I pulled into the driveway at home. I got a text from my girlfriend asking if I was okay. I responded yes and asked why she didn't answer my previous call. She said she never received one. I headed inside and on the counter I saw my mother's cell phone, the one I tied to call. Picked it up. No missed calls. Nothing in the call history. There was a part of my college campus that was generally acknowledged to be haunted. It was a historic building from the 1930s. Nothing terrible was supposed to have happened there or anything, but I always got a creepy vibe there. There were a lot of art classes there, and I'd gone there after dark with a friend to study slides for tests before, and it creeped us out so badly that we would come together and leave together and never ever be there alone, though I didn't have problems being alone anywhere else on campus at night. So, one evening, I was jogging and it was getting dark. The so-called haunted building had a long path that led up to it, and it would have been a great spot to jog. Just go all the way up the path to the building, and then jog back down and jog back to my dorm and I'd be done. I knew it was super creepy and I knew I'd had a hard time going there after dark, but I reasoned that it was just my overactive imagination and there was nothing to be afraid of. I jogged up to the entrance and then started down the path. I ran down the path for about 30 seconds, and then before I even knew what was happening, I had turned around and was running in the other direction, back toward the street. My body turned around before my brain even processed anything. I don't know what turned me around, but I didn't turn around to look. I ran as fast as I could out of there, found another route for my jog, and went back to my dorm. I never even thought about going there after dark again. In retrospect, I figured there was possibly a violent person who liked to hang out there. There had been a few reported rapes in the wilderness surrounding the campus, though nowhere near that area in particular, or a dangerous animal, maybe. It freaks me out what my subconscious saw that I didn't. I imagine an alternate reality where I kept running down the path. Maybe I emerged fine, but maybe I didn't. When I was 15, I was walking home in the dark from the train station around 10 p.m. at night. It was a narrow one-side road for pedestrians, other side was the railway, and there was very few street lights to give vision. As I was walking down this long stretch, I noticed a ghastly white figure in the distance, like a blurry white spot all the way on the other end of this long-winded road. Because the street was completely straight, I could see it relatively clearly. As I got closer, my fight or flight response started kicking in and I wasn't sure if I should turn back or, being the level-headed person / non-believer of supernatural things person I normally am, soldier on. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman that was almost completely wearing white clothing. I thought that's odd and just accelerated my walking speed in the hopes I would get past her quicker. As I got very close towards her, I realized that the lady was wearing a full wedding gown including a full-blown veil. I could hardly see her face through the blurriness of the veil and the darkness of the night. At this point my heart was practically jumping out of my chest and my brain was struggling to come to grips of what I was really seeing. I also noticed that there was something very odd about the way the lady was moving. It was at this stage I realized it looked like she was floating / sliding across the floor. I couldn't see her legs either due to the dress. Now you might think this is where it ends, but there's more. After I finally walked past her, a moment which seemed like to last forever, I accelerated my speed to jogging speed and did not / was too scared to look back. After I had passed about 4 to 5 houses, out of curiosity / fear that she was stalking me somehow, I looked back. She was gone. After seeing her disappear, I ran to the nearest cross street and have not gone back down that street to this day. Now keep in mind there was no side streets down this road and the other side was a railway track. Sure, she may have gone into one of those houses, but what are the chances? And why on earth was she wearing a full-blown wedding gown in the dark of the night? These questions still plague me to this day. Me and my cousins were playing in my grandparents' basement that was a long room that we could play red light green light in. My grandparents' basement was hella creepy though, and the only reason we were playing there was because there was like 5 of us and the longest part of it was close to the stairs. There were a couple bedrooms and a laundry / storage room down there too. In one of the bedrooms my grandmother kept this dancing sunflower that was a motion detector and sung the "You Are My Sunshine, My Only Sunshine" song. So all of us lined up playing red light green light, suddenly hear that twisted little sunflower start singing all the way from the back bedroom in the dark where none of us were even near close enough to set off the motion detector. We all screamed and bolted for the staircase. It was terrifying and made us more afraid of the basement than ever even now years later. My mom was living in the middle of nowhere, Texas, in a town with a population of a whopping 150 people. Seriously, farmlands and prairies for miles. The town was located below elevation where cell reception, edge / 2G only in this town, was pretty special due to it being surrounded by a giant hill. Also, no police. Rural towns in Texas usually hire out the county sheriffs or adjacent towns' law enforcement. I was on winter break from college and didn't have anywhere else to go for the break, so I was staying at her house. A week before Christmas, my mom and brother leave for holiday in Boston, where we also have family. So the house was mine for about 2 weeks, cue Home Alone theme. I had my trusty, bark at everything in the world, dachshund with me as well. My mom's house is pretty isolated in this town. In fact, the closest thing around the house was an abandoned college building, which ironically relocated to the same city I was attending college in. Much of the house was sitting adjacent to a road that led down miles and miles of Texas prairies and nothingness. Seriously, it looked like the house was built for someone who was a recluse and didn't want to be bothered by anyone. Ever. A couple of nights after my mom and brother leave, I'm with my dog on the Chase Lounge catching up on some shows on my laptop. It had been storming much of the day and my internet was down. I resorted to my external hard drive filled with pirated shows I had been meaning to catch up on while on break. Yes, I deleted them after, don't worry. After several hours of pirated TV watching, I finally doze off. 3 hours of sleep in, around 2:30 a.m., I wake up to my dog growling. Note, my dachshund is not one to fuck with. The dog seriously has some social issues when it comes to other people. Barks at everything, so my dog quiets down for a bit and we try to go back to sleep. Well, I start hearing leaves rustling around the house, like another animal outside, which I assumed it was. My dog starts growling again and finally again settles down. It's around 3 a.m. now, so I can't sleep now. I turn on the TV and sit in the sofa with my dog. Well, 15 minutes later, a knock on my door. My dog flips his shit and goes crazy. So obviously, I am not going to answer it at this time of the hour with fear of having a Children of the Corn reenactment. So I just let it be. We'll get this, 5, yes I said 5 fucking minutes passed and the knock comes again, but this time it's a constant knock. I'm seriously shitting bricks right now thinking of what to do. My dog is going nuts from the knocking. So I finally suck it up and peek out the window. I see a guy on my porch. I call out, not opening the door of course, asking if I could help him with something. Get this. No fucking response. Yet the dude is still knocking. I'm like, WTF? I seriously peed my pants then. I had no weapon on me as, seriously, didn't know why my mom was so fearless to not have one where she was located. Also, did I mention my dog was still going AWOL while this was going on? Lol. I finally get in touch with someone with 911, however they said the constable was on duty elsewhere, so they would have to get an officer from the next town over to help. They said it would be about 20 minutes before an officer arrived. Lost service with 911, so I didn't have anyone to keep me calm anymore until the officer arrived. So I was like, shit, should I just bite the bullet and answer the door while armed with a knife? So that's what I end up doing. I call out and tell him I'm armed, failed to mention to him, with a fucking kitchen knife, and to not make any fast movements. I open the door, and I asked again, who are you and what do you want? The guy looked like he had Down syndrome or something. And he just looked at me and, I fucking kid you not, said, wanna play a game with me? Yep, in that short moment of my precious existence, I think I relived my most memorable moments of my life and prayed to God my family would find my body to bury it. So immediately I just fucking closed the door. Epilogue, after I closed the door, he knocked a couple of more times and left. Shortly after an officer arrived. After speaking with the officer about it, it turns out that this is a common problem in this town with this guy. The guy had a couple of mental disorders, later to find out he had schizophrenia and another mental illness I won't name on here. I packed up my bags and my dog and drove to my dad's house that night. Not me, but a true story of something that happened recently to my mother. My mother was having dinner at a friend's house. It was a small old cottage that's been around for 100 years. She tries to find the bathroom and pulls on a door that is locked. The friend sees and says, sorry, that goes to the basement, the bathroom is over there. Thinking it is odd, my mother asks why the basement door is locked. It's always locked, in fact I don't even have a key for it. The real estate agent advised me not to go down there as it's not been upgraded like the rest of the cottage. It's little more than a root cellar. Fast forward a few weeks, when my mother, who works for the police department's community division, is working on a project about the history of the police department in the town. An old man comes in with news clippings about various community events, as well as a news clipping from the 50s about a gruesome murder. My mom was a bit taken aback. Sorry, I forgot those clippings were in here too. No, I know this address, it's my friend's house. What happened there? Oh, said the old man. Well, that used to be my mother's house. She had been dating this man who was cruel to her. beat her horribly. She tried again and again to break it off with him, but he'd always come back. Finally my aunt moved in with us, and my mother finally broke up with him. He starts getting emotional, then one night he broke in, and tied my mother, aunt, sister, and brother up in the basement. He shot them all in front of my mother. Then he shot her, and killed himself, leaving a note that she would never leave him again. I was away at college. He started to sob. And that is how my mother's friend learned she has a haunted quadruple murder-suicide scene in her basement. She moved out a year later. Not me, but a friend told me this. They were driving on an unlit road outside of town, when he noticed his car felt heavy. Like it was struggling to keep up with the speed, and a car kept flashing its lights behind him. His first thought was some hooligan was trying to get him to pull over. That particular area is a red zone, so he stepped up the speed. The car struggled even more, so he reduced the speed to prevent a blowout, while shifting slightly to the side of the road and prayed the guy just wants to overtake. It didn't. It just kept on flashing the lights from behind while tailgating until they entered town, where the heaviness went away and the car also left him alone. He just went along like usual until the next day he started wondering WTF was that last night. My brother and I do HVAC installs. A few years ago we were working for a friend of his, a family of 5, mom, dad, 2 daughters and a son. The kids were all aged 5 to 7. The dad was at work during the day and the mom stayed with the kids. The day we had the install scheduled, the mom told us she had a fundraiser to go to and would not be at home. This isn't out of the ordinary for customers to leave while installs are happening. Mom and the kids leave, lock the door behind them, and my brother and I get to work in the crawl space under the kitchen. About an hour later my brother and I both hear footsteps right above us, in the kitchen. The footsteps make their way to the stairs that go down to the crawl space, then stop. My brother and I, both hearing this, silently look at one another and he shouts hello, thinking it's the mom or the dad that came home. No response. So we crawl out of the crawl space and look around, door locked still, nothing moved or missing, undisturbed house. We look at one another, shrug it off, mention that's weird, then get back to work. About 2 hours go by and we hear the same thing again, heavy footsteps through the kitchen, but these go upstairs, then back down to the kitchen and to the top of the stairs to the crawl space. My brother and I look at one another, knowing we each hear it, and freeze. It takes us a few minutes of dead silence before he again shouts hello. Again, no response. We crawl out of the crawl space, and the same situation as before, nothing out of place. Customers come home later and we've finished up. We ask them if someone came home during the day or if someone has a spare set of keys. No, and no. My brother and I still look back on this and can't comprehend it. 2 situations that are related sorta. Some backstory is that I have issues sleeping and with stress management, and it isn't new to me to hallucinate something if I'm under a lot of stress, so I tend to discount odd things I may see, as well as trying to find humor in it if I'm around other people. First situation was after hanging out with a friend at the time. We both had some stressful stuff going on and were wrapping up on a decompressing friend day to cope. It was August, so it was muggy and gross and started to pour after we got in the car. Almost all the way home, at a red light, pretty quiet in the car as the day is winding down, and I notice the rain looks like it's making an outline. With the above backstory, I sort of attribute it to the weird patterns of the rain and lack of proper sleep/self-care, and I keep staring at this outline. It looks like a set of legs and feet standing there, no torso noticeable. Then the legs begin to walk across the street, and essentially it's like seeing the rain bounce off of someone without someone being there. It was odd and weird, and about halfway across the street I lost sight of the legs. I waited a few to think about it and mentioned to my friend that I had the weirdest visual trick, and her response was just the legs crossing the road, right? We made sure to not talk about it outside of that and went to a third person who confirmed we described the same thing. The second one was similar, but I didn't have another person to visually confirm. I was in the car with my girlfriend driving, again at a red light, and I'm sort of looking around and observing things as I tend to do as a passenger. There's a delivery truck up ahead and I see someone walking around the other side of the truck with blue jeans on. I figured it was just someone walking by or it was the driver. I keep an eye since I'm nosy and I want to know, and the person is walking towards where we are parked, and turns at the crosswalk to cross the street. At first I thought they were wearing a shirt that matched the color of the truck, however as it got far enough I couldn't find a torso or anything, really, but jeans and sneakers walking on their own. There's no way they'd have a shirt on that blended with the vibrant truck and the pavement of the road. I turned to tell my girlfriend this is all a span of maybe 15 seconds, and when I made eye contact with her, the legs, person, thing, would have been halfway across the street, but I wasn't able to spot it again when I tried to point it out. When I was a kid I was playing by the woods at night catching fireflies. We lived out in the middle of nowhere. About a half-hour drive to the closest town. Well anyway, I hear some sticks breaking and I'm getting excited thinking it might be a wild turkey. I was fucking obsessed with the things even though they weren't known for the area. I was a dumb kid, but now I know that by the sound of the cracking sticks that it could not have been a turkey but something quite a bit bigger. I run over towards the trees and further from the house and I start to get this feeling. Like I felt before I was about to be punished. Shouts of adrenaline and fear. I stopped moving immediately and my eyes were darting along the tree line rapidly searching for what was causing that fear as I broke out in a cold sweat. Two bright eyes, like a cat's eyes, sat about 3 feet above the ground, about the size of a baseball. It wasn't like the eyes watching from the darkness in movies where they are glaring. These eyes were wide open, unblinking, and staring right at me. I felt like prey. Then, slowly, the eyes rose up until the creature was standing at about 6 feet high. Now I could see its outline. It was huge, bigger than anything I had ever seen. That was when its lips pulled back from its teeth and I hauled ass back to my house. I told my dad and he gave me a spanking with the paddle for lying. My best friend and I enjoy exploring the older cemeteries around LA. One day we decided to check out Rosedale Cemetery, just driving around and checking out the grave sites of historical figures. We end up in the northeast corner and notice there's a rather unusually shaped tombstone, very tall with a hollow center big enough for a man to pass through. We start walking over to check it out and both of us sort of get overcome with this feeling of foreboding. It was a nice sunny day, and we'd been having a really pleasant time up until this happened. As soon as we're about 15 feet away, my friend in front of me as I follow, I see a flash of what looked like black pants running toward us. In a split second it was directly in front of us, then gone. I was so startled I just kind of froze, and then something fell from the tree we were under and hit me in the back. I freaked out at this point and started running back to my car, my friend close behind. He hadn't seen it but he definitely felt like we were not welcome in that part of the place. As we drove away more branches and these nut things fell from the trees and hit my back windows. We were basically forced out of the cemetery. A few friends and I like going into abandoned places and taking really cool pictures, a lot of those urban and forgotten type things. We never take anything, and also never break anything or cause damage. We simply go and take pictures. Before going, we stock up on gas masks, flashlights, and scan police radios to get an idea of their patrol patterns of these areas. The four of us have done this a lot and post the pictures online on a blog site. Basically, we are very careful. My friend who finds these places scouted an abandoned mental hospital about 40 minutes away from our town the day before. He said that it was completely abandoned and safe. Flash forward to 10 o'clock that night, we pull into this lot, climb a fence, and are inside the hospital grounds. The first floor was pretty unremarkable, and our gas masks kept us safe from anything in the air. The second floor was a little creepy. There were lots of dirty mattresses and folders with files on people. Our lights revealed creepy mugshot-like pictures of people in these folders. We didn't take pictures of those because of privacy. Things started to get creepy when we found satanic graffiti, which would have been cool if it were light out, and a tall cross standing in the middle of a hallway, propped up by a stand. As we started to see this stuff I started to feel really uneasy, which is unusual as we had been in other creepier abandoned places, like a church and an orphanage. As we were nearing the stairs to the third floor, creepy things started to happen. Despite almost being sure that the building was empty, we heard footsteps on the floor above us. We found this creepy as that the floor seemed thick enough to deaden all sound. We saw tall shadows walking by doorways, and heard whispering. We wanted to get off of that floor, so we started to climb the stairs to the last level. Something must have not wanted us up there, because we all heard a scream as clear as day. We were all in the stairwell, and this scream was like nothing I had heard before. It was like a scream and a roar all at the same time. It was inhuman, and almost sounded amplified, probably because of how narrow the stairs were. Now, this group is a bunch of teenage guys who consider themselves to be pretty brave. Without even talking to each other we got the hell out of there, sprinted to the car, and sped home. To this day none of us know what happened in there. We sometimes revisit sites but we won't ever be going back to this one. One night after coming home from dinner with my husband, we went to the kitchen to chow down on some ice cream. We were having a good time laughing and talking at the end of our kitchen island. I was talking at the time, stopped mid-sentence and started looking around, asking my husband, "Did you hear that?" My husband responded, "Yeah, the growl." We both heard a deep guttural, heavy-breathed growl right next to our ear. When I heard the growl I felt heavy breath on the side of my face. I was totally freaked so I started looking around for an explanation. My father was babysitting for us that night. It was sort of late, so I thought it was him asleep in the den, which was right next to the kitchen. He snores like freight train. I looked and no one was there. He was on the other side of the house asleep with our child. It couldn't have been him. I looked for any logical explanation, TV, stereo, etc., and couldn't figure it out. My husband and I talked about it for a while. We heard exactly the same thing, although he did not feel the breath. We were freaked and decided to call it a night and go upstairs to bed. I was completely terrified. It shook me completely. I wouldn't let my husband leave my sight for a second the rest of the night. The growl didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. Luckily, that was the only time something like that has happened. Even though it was years ago, it still creeps me out thinking about. I will never forget that sound or the feeling of the breath on the side of my face/neck. We had a lot of strange/creepy events happen in that house, but that was the worst for sure. There are the old foundations of some stone houses up on the hill behind us, dug right into the rock, the same rock our house is made of, incidentally. Me and my childhood BFF used to hang out up there in what we imagined to be the basement of this long-gone house. All that's left are some eroded stone steps down and the indentation in the hillside of the basement/foundations. We didn't do anything, really, except sit and talk. We went up there every day for weeks one summer, and then one day, we both get this very powerful sense of dread, that we shouldn't be there. We both said, in our own way, that the fairies didn't want us there. British kids tilde, like. I know I, at least, could almost feel the force of someone's dislike for my presence shoving at me. And then suddenly, we're just running. I honestly remember very little. We were sitting there, suddenly freaked out, and then hurtling down the hillside, across 2 fields, over my garden gate, and inside the house, in what felt like seconds, but had to be minutes. I must have slipped at some point because I had sheep poop streaked all the way up my side, but I don't remember falling. Well, now I'm 27 now and I flat out won't go to that place. I'll go around it, I'll go near it, but I am not stepping foot in what I feel like are its boundaries. Never again. When me and my sister still lived with mom in the city, we used to visit grandma often. Grandma put most of her money on cigarettes and gambling with her already unstable economy, so there wasn't much for us kids to do at her place. We must have been around 5 to 7 years old at the time. My grandma did have a doll for my sister and a box of crayons for me, yay, gender roles. This doll was an old interactive one. If you pressed on its hands or feet it would say a sentence, depending on what limb you press. It was old, so we had to press really hard for it to say anything, and easiest was its one hand, I remember. When pressed it said, "Mommy, I'm hungry." Time went on and the old doll finally broke down. I was freaked out at dolls at the time, still am to be honest, and it didn't make the situation better when the toy was starting to break down, with the voice turning static and dark, like a demonic voice. So my grandmother said we had to throw it, to my sister's disapproval, and so my grandma removed the batteries and let it sit on the kitchen table. Being a loving older brother, I let her draw with my crayons. And suddenly we hear a voice from the kitchen that did not belong to either mom or grandma. It was the doll. And it said, "Mommy, I'm hungry." Like it used to, without the static or darkness. Our grandmother's mother had passed away recently, so she told us kids it was probably her soul taking a last goodbye of us. Sweet thought, but I will never forget the terror that gripped me that day. Easy. Crazy naked forest person. I'm going to college in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the things they do is offer this 5-day backpacking trip into the woods. Neat, thought I'll go on that. Day 1, something that gets mentioned offhand is the crazy naked forest people. I didn't doubt them for a second. It's a liberal college town. Hell, I'm pretty sure there's some kind of mushroom cult that meets in the garden behind my dorms on Saturdays. Story for another time. Point is, this wasn't out of the realm of possibilities at all. But it's one thing to talk about crazy naked tweakers in the forest, and another thing to encounter one. 3rd day we get lost, end up spending the night on some old logging roads. It was surreal, just this line that cut through the forest for miles. I wake up in the middle of the night because there's a lemon that needs squeezing. So, I go down the road a bit and it's pitch black. No, not really dark. I mean, aside from my headlamp, there is no light. So I had just put the snake back in its pen when I hear the gravel shift behind me, and I turn right around to see what's behind me. Standing there, shambling across the road, is this butt-ass naked dude with no light of his own. He was probably the pastiest white I've ever seen. Hair was matted and greasy, and the eyes, just dead to the world, didn't respond to anything. How do I know he had dead eyes? He turned his head and just stood there staring at me, or maybe at something behind me, I didn't know, and I sure as hell wasn't taking my eyes off him to find out. After what feels like forever, He turns around and heads back into the woods, without any light. And make my way, quickly, back to the tents and go back to sleep. The funny thing is, I have no way of knowing whether or not this actually happened. Might have just been a really vivid dream. Either way, those moments when I was getting stared down, not sure if I was about to have my face eaten off, were some of the most terrifying in my life. This was about 5 years ago during summer in college. My housemate was out with his girlfriend for the evening, and I was at home by myself. After a night of doing basically nothing, I got tired and went to bed around midnight, shutting my door as to not be disturbed when my roommate came home. We also had a dog that slept in his little bed in the living room every night. About 30 minutes into me lying in bed, I heard what sounded like the front door opening / being messed with. I assumed it was my roommate, but it didn't sound like anyone was walking around the house. All our floors were made of tile, super easy to hear footsteps. Then I started to hear random percussive noises, and my dog started barking his head off. That's when I started getting freaked out. Our dog rarely ever barked at anything. Dog came over to my door and started whimpering and clawing at it, which in turn made my hair stand up because I knew he was scared of something. Then I heard the computer chair in the living room, used as the house gaming chair, roll across the tile floor, and dog proceeded to whimper and bark even louder. There was no way in hell I was opening my door. I was scared out of my damn mind. After a few minutes of the dog barking, he settled down and the noises stopped, but I was sitting straight up in my bed freaking the hell out. During this whole ordeal, not once did I hear footsteps. I sat there for 2 hours until I heard my roommate come home with his girlfriend, and I told them what happened. She freaked out and went home, and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. This was maybe 5 years ago. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in an 80 to 100-year-old house. I woke up around 1 a.m. with a weird feeling. I didn't jump awake, but just woke up feeling concerned. It's hard to describe, but I felt alerted and that I was being watched. As I looked around, without sitting up, I see a face looking at me through the semi-open bedroom door. The face was illuminated by my alarm clock, that I turn away from because the LCD screen is too bright. It's an old woman's face. She is looking directly at me. She is looking me in the eyes. Her head is tilted sideways a little, as if she's standing behind the door, peering around into the room. She has sliver/white hair that looks damaged from years dyeing or perms or whatever, old lady hair. Her face is wrinkled and she has sallow cheeks. I'm 75% sure her ethnicity was Caucasian, but she may have been Asian or light-skinned Middle Eastern. She was smiling with a closed mouth. When I noticed her face, I sort of froze for a moment and took a sharp inhale of breath. She reacted by smiling wider, revealing her teeth. We just stared at each other with locked eyes for what seemed like a million years. I watched her move slightly, as he inhaled and exhaled. I finally reacted and I grabbed the knife I keep in the bedside table. I jumped out of bed and charged into the next room, but she was gone. When I looked away to grab the knife, she must have disappeared. I can't interpret whether or not the smile was sinister, motherly, curious, friendly or otherwise. It felt sinister, but that may have been skewed by me waking up to a face in my home. I've never seen anything ever again, and I hope it stays that way. Back when I was in high school, I was working at this small burger joint near the edge of town. Business started to pick up at the time, so my manager decided to extend the hours and keep the place open until 3 or so in the morning. Well, one night I was scheduled to work the graveyard shift and work from 9 p.m. to close. In order to kill time since it got really slow, my coworker and I started talking and he started telling me about this old fry cook that used to work in the same burger joint a few years before, and apparently one night that fry cook accidentally cut off his own hand. My coworker also told me that every Tuesday night, the phone will ring 3 times, the lights will flicker on and off, and then a city bus will stop in front of the restaurant and drop a mysterious figure off. Nobody ever experiences those supernatural events because the restaurant never stayed open that late until then. The worst part is that the night I was working there, it was a Tuesday. The phone rang 3 times but nobody was on the other end of the line, the lights flickered on and off, and there was a bus that pulled up in front of the restaurant. Scariest night of my life. I grew up in the hood. Bad things happened all the time, but they were caused by other humans. People causing other people grief is a daily routine around these parts. Following that idea, my family had always been active in the Catholic Church to try and show us kids how to be nice to one another. I spent a good chunk of my time running around the old halls and yards of my childhood church while my mom chatted away or organized some kind of event. But a lot of the classes they taught for catechism were in this small and old convent adjacent to the church, right across the street. Unlike a regular convent, the old 2-story building did not house nuns or monks. A solitary old priest lived in a huge loft upstairs and only had books to keep him company as he was a professor at UC Berkeley. The rest of the rooms were empty and the church kept renting the rooms for cheap to recent immigrant families from Mexico. They were usually nice, but whatever families or church members lived there didn't stay too long. The church needed to have someone there as a caretaker, but few people stayed too long, with good reason. The entire place gives you shivers. Every room turns odd and oppressing after people leave, and the atmosphere gets very dark when the classes were over and people cleaned up after the end of catechism. The small chapel in the back was the worst because the crucifix seemed to react to you being there. I wandered into the basement a few times and could never stay too long because it freaked me out. The second floor of this place was just as bad. You never wanted to wander, and as a bored kid at an empty church, that's all you can do. To give you an idea of what this place is like, imagine the old Resident Evil mansion from PS1. It's old, plain looking, but the air is just foreboding and you feel like you're walking around in circles. The second floor is always dark and creepy, and when nighttime does arrive I could never find myself wandering too far on my own. Turns out I wasn't alone. Years later my mom, who is still active in the church, tells me the convent gives her the creeps and she prefers being there with people with lights on. We also found out the worst bit of news: the convent had been shut down by the diocese after a man broke in and raped a nun decades ago. After that the church was never allowed to house anyone from the church. I haven't been there in years, but I've always wanted to go back with my camera gear and catch some kind of anomaly. So, every year on the Canada Day long weekend, my family and some friends of ours go out to a cabin in the Rockies in southeast BC that my grandfather owns. This year we had 10 people including me. Lots of alcohol, lots of card games, typical Canada Day celebration. We arrived the day before, June 30th, and had a fairly relaxed day. The partying would wait until tomorrow. To clarify, no alcohol in my system when I went to bed at 2 a.m. Well, after probably about a half hour of lying in bed trying to sleep, I hear what I can only describe as a drum in the distance. Think of the drum that the goblins beat in the first Lord of the Rings movie after Pippin knocks the skeleton down the well in Moria. It sounded exactly like that, off in the distance, I'd say at least 2 km somewhere off to the west of where we were staying, the noise happening every 3 seconds or so. This goes on for probably no more than 7 to 10 minutes, and then just stops as suddenly as it started. I was nearly shitting my pants at that point. Got no sleep. It served to make matters worse that I noticed that there was not a single bird chirping when the sun came over the horizon, when every single previous time I had been there, the birds were always in the hundreds making a ton of noise at that time. Only ever told one of my friends who was staying with us the next day. She said she didn't hear the noises and was up too late for the birds, but she did note that she had a nightmare that night. It's still really fucking scary to think about what the fuck that drum could have been. There are no signs of civilization in the spot that I think the noise was coming from. My friend's house was bought really cheap because the woman who used to live in it had shot herself in the head. I would house sit often and slept in the guest room, and I had not been thinking about it at all. One night every time I closed my eyes it sounded like someone was sweeping outside the room in the hardwood floor hallway. Every time I opened my eyes it stopped. Okay, that's weird. Let's try to sleep. I don't know about you, but when I dream, everything is different. Structure, colors, placement of items are different, but the feel and items are usually the same. I was finally able to go to sleep, or at least I think I did, and I had this dream except everything was exactly the same as if I actually opened my eyes. The only creepy thing is this woman standing by the bed in front of me, all black, just freaking standing there. Then all of a sudden she jumps right up to my face, and last thing I saw was a really fucked up black and white face. I freaked out and tried to wake up my boyfriend, but he was just out. So I had to lay there terrified and somehow managed to go back to sleep. Everyone thought it was funny and didn't believe me. Until she got to my boyfriend at another time. This time I had gone to work, and when I came back my boyfriend asked if I had come home earlier, but I didn't. When I asked why, he told me that about 2 hours after I left that he heard my car pull up, me walk into the house, come into the room and set my keys down on the chair I always did, and physically get into bed. When he turned around he noticed I wasn't there. Nobody was there. He didn't go back to bed after. Shadow man driving through a faceless woman in a Victorian dress, white wolf-like entity walking through my room as a child. Now I have something very negative in the apartment my GF and myself share. I'm a cable guy in a old town, I see lots of things. Once had a lady that was insistent that I not go into a specific room of her home because that's where the demon resides. She told me her phone was bleeding in her hand. There was one in her attic also. She said it walks around in the attic. Can confirm as I've heard it myself. The turnover on her upstairs apartment was about 2 weeks for about 2 years straight. My girlfriend had been to the house in the past. She said she would never go back. Our town has a past of Capone prohibition and prostitution. We dug up Wapasha graves to build the downtown district. In the area, I've seen a lot. Not just in my town of residence either. My grandparents' house is pretty old, built around 1930s or possibly earlier. It has a basement, main floor, and upper floor. The top floor is just 2 bedrooms up at the peak of the roof, one on each side of the top landing. We'd always be spending the night at their house during the summer, and since those rooms had the only beds, the rest of us had to share a fold-out couch. We'd take turns using the bedrooms. But after a particular weekend one summer, my older brother refused to sleep in the room on the right. He'd sleep outside before spending a night in that bed. When my parents asked him why, he'd say that he just had a terrible feeling when he was in there, like someone bad was watching him and didn't want him there. A few months later I got the same feeling. Maybe my brother's words were getting to me, or maybe I really felt what he did. Either way, I wouldn't sleep there either. So we talked up our grandma. Told her how the room made us feel scared, like someone was watching, and we didn't want to be in there. And she told us that a man had committed suicide in that room by hanging himself. I was working on the weekend with my line manager. I worked in the IT department for the local council managing the phone system. I can't remember the exact work that day, but I was on the top floor of the old council offices. Myself, my manager, and 2 social services staff were in the building that day. The building had 2 wings depressed by a stairwell. One wing was abandoned as new offices had been built, and then there was a really creepy atmosphere over that side. Luckily I was in the area where people did work. I was sat in an office on my own waiting for a call from my manager telling me to move on to the next room. Suddenly I hear banging coming from the room next door. It sounded like a cubicle door being open and shut. Where I was sat I could see out down the corridor to both stairwells and the door to the room with the banging. I suspected it was probably a window left open in the toilets. The building was really old and the windows often didn't seal. I went next door to look, but it wasn't a bathroom. I didn't know the floor well and wasn't sure which room was what. I opened the door to find an empty office and no banging. Needless to say, I bolted downstairs to where my manager was sat. He was the kind of guy to pull pranks, but I could tell this wasn't one of them times. He was in a rush to leave and was busy getting the work done. I told him what happened and we went to look together. No banging could be heard and we found nothing. He was pretty freaked out too, as there were reports of workers dying in accidents during its construction. We finished up as quick as we could and left.